Hello everyone, my name is Tim O'Riordan. I'm Professor of Environmental Sciences at the University of East Anglia. I'm speaking to you from Mandela House in Blantyre, the capital of Malawi. I'm here as a guest of the Responsible Safari Company, which is a company that is dedicated to promoting the sustainability of people and place in and around the whole of the Malawian area, and is very much part of what I believe is the New Look company, which is socially responsible, but earning an enterprise-based living, not only for its own directors and employees, but also for many people in the country here that can benefit from the application of sustainability for improving their well-being. What I'd like to do today is give you some sense of the big picture facing the planet at the present time and how that bears upon any visit you might like to make to Malawi, hopefully as guests of the Responsible Safari Company. And I start with the well-known fact, but it's not given much emphasis, that the last 10 million years was known by geologists as the Holocene, was a period of unusual calm and benign climatic conditions. In fact, the Holocene was probably quite special in the history of the planet in that it was perfect for the nurturing of any form of life and really began the process whereby the ape population shifted steadily toward what we now call Homo sapiens. And you, I'm sure, know that there were many different false starts before Homo sapiens, as we have become, actually finally entered the fray and became part of the human family. But it's worth emphasizing that the success of human evolution probably was largely due to the fact that throughout this period, and particularly in the last 5 million years, there's been relatively little hardship from the way in which the Earth's climatic system was operating compared with the convulsions of the past with massive volcanic activity and die-outs and so on. So one of the things which is actually striking for me and part of this particular phase is that we now at a unique point in human history where we have become a species so dominant in influencing the way in which natural systems and Earth's systems themselves function, that we've become the dominant player. And that's why the phrase Holocene has passed over to a new epoch called the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene means an era whereby human beings are now the main creators of what we will call the natural world, and how that is made available to future generations, not only of humans, but of all non-life forms as well, and indeed life forms, because we are an interconnected planet of both biological and non-biological activities, chemical, physical, energy-related, and of course organic in relation to life. And the consequence of that is that a number of people have done some studies and have shown that the phase of the Anthropocene is now reaching the point where significant parts of the Earth's life support system have been altered to the point where they're not easily repaired. And of these, three stand out in the work of the body called the Resilience Alliance in Stockholm, which has had a lot of attention by the scientific community in the last 4 or 5 years. One is the loss of biodiversity, which is now well documented and is a function largely of the huge amount of removal of forest and marine and other ecosystems by human beings, increasingly more rapidly over the last 30 or 40 years. And the loss of biodiversity is regarded as one of the most significant pieces of human intervention that we have, because with the loss of biodiversity comes the effect on life support itself, what is sometimes referred to as ecosystem functioning. And the very basis around which the Earth ticks over as a living organic planet is also being undermined by the loss of biodiversity. By any standards, therefore, the loss of biodiversity and the damage to ecosystem functioning are regarded as one of the most important first stages of the Anthropocene and the threat that it may be posing to our own generation, but particularly to future generations, who by definition have no say in what we're doing right now. The second major area is climate change, or carbon addition, and the greenhouse gas alteration of the lower atmosphere. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute, but that's certainly another area where human beings have reached a stage where they are significantly influencing what we will call the climate, and it could be argued that there is no such thing any longer as a natural climate variability. There's only a interventing climate variability, a human hand affected climate variability. So if you want to be very dramatic, you could say there's no such thing as nature's climate any longer. It's something which is distorted by the alteration of climatic forces by human intervention. And the third area, which is not so well known about, is the area of nitrogen, where the cycling of nitrogen is now overwhelmed by the way human beings have changed nitrogen, because it's the main base both for fertilizer and also for plastics. And so it has a very significant consequence if we alter that. But waiting in the wings are 3 or 4 of those so-called earth threats. One is phosphorus, because that's another major nutrient, but also in the wrong place can give rise to very damaging growth and the destruction of water resources, particularly coastal and river resources. And then we have the acidification of the oceans, because the carbon dioxide we're producing is actually now, some of it being absorbed by the oceans, and now is steadily making more acid the surface and subsurface of oceans. And we're beginning to recognize that this in turn may give rise to damage to coral reefs, particularly when you have a warming ocean as well, and also very considerable effect on marine biota, particularly marine biota which depend upon calcium carbonate shells, because that is slightly soluble in the acidified oceans that we're now getting. So we're beginning to realize that the world as we see it with the Anthropocene, just simply in what are called the Earth systems front, that is the big global cycles of energy and materials, is having its effect. And then when you throw on that deforestation, you throw on top of that loss of soil, you throw on that massive change into oceans and ocean currents, and you throw on top of that the whole question of the alteration of ice and sea level, you begin to get a sense that we're now in a world where the Anthropocene is, if it's left unattended and becomes accelerated, could become very damaging indeed to present and certainly to future generations. But at the same time, we're at a world where the human knowledge of this and the scientific understanding of this and the sheer data gathering by the sophisticated use of computers and satellites and all other forms of information gathering, not least, by the way, the iPhone, which in the hands of citizens and school children is an enormously influential piece of documentation, because people with the right training can record all kinds of things that happen in their neighborhoods, which may be worth bearing in mind, like the onset of the first flowering, whether bee population is declining, what happens after a major flood. All of this kind of thing can be documented by people in their own backyards and in their communities, and that's part of the global data gathering process that we're beginning to draw together in what's called the global science of sustainability. So the second half of this Anthropocene is that we're in a world where we really are knowing now enough to be certain that if we carry on like this, there will be significant alterations to the life support of the planet, and particularly to those who do not have the resources, the capability, the wealth, technology, the mobilization to be able to adjust and adapt in time to these kinds of forces. So the vulnerability of many parts of the world's population to potentially great threats to their livelihood and to their health are very much part of the challenge that we face in this modern age of grappling with science and sustainability and how we deal with this as a species. And so in a nutshell, we have two choices. We can either blind ourselves to these forces or feel that we're unable to change, or because we have forces of power and influence and global domination that make it almost impossible to have any kind of real social and economic and cultural transformation towards sustainability. So we lock ourselves in to some remorseless tragedy. That, at the worst end of the analysis, is one possibility. More hopeful in the way in which I'm addressing this, and certainly the way in which the responsible safari company wish to take this, is to provide ways in which people can be transformative, can be enlightened, can be made aware, can be part of community organization, to start to repair what's going on, and in the process of doing that, generate wealth and income for themselves and for their children, and really transform the way in which they are operating as a community into what we would call sustainability, citizenship in action, in a very constructive and very heartfelt way. And this so-called double fork, one going downwards toward a negativity, one going upwards toward creativity and new forms of innovation and evolution, that mix is what we're facing. And I think the next decade gives us the chance of a lifetime, and in fact almost a chance of the millennium, for the human species to decide which way to go and how to get on and do it. And the world of sustainability science is the world which is addressing these questions. So that gives you some sense of what I would call the big picture and what people are now talking about. What does this actually play out in terms of the major issues facing the Earth, and what does this mean for the way society might grapple with these issues as we go forward? Well, the first of these big questions, and we can't avoid it, is the issue of climate change. And there are a number of reasons why I put this first. It is remorselessly inevitable. Once you put these greenhouse gases, particularly carbon dioxide and methane, which we're generating by human endeavour, into the lower atmosphere, like it or not, each molecule warms for 75 years, and the effect of adding carbon dioxide and methane and other greenhouse gases, but they're less important in terms of volume as these first two are. And the first two are particularly ones we need to focus on if we want to get over the issue of climate change. As we put these into the lower atmosphere, the lag effect of their propulsive power in warming the planet is a matter of a couple of decades. So the effects of warming already influencing themselves in terms of changes of climate, changes of sea level, changes of ice availability, melting and the like. Those things are really caused by the carbon dioxide at the end of last century. Now we're getting a carbon dioxide pulse which is even more, starting all the way through this century, and that will show up in further alterations in world's weather and in global warming overall, and certainly effects on ice and oceans and so on in the 2030s and 2040s. So the first thing about climate change, which is so powerful, is its remorseless unavoidability. That means that every time we move to try and reduce carbon dioxide and methane emissions, we're making a contribution to the next generation and the one beyond. And that's why it's so important, even at the micro level, to start addressing how to reduce carbon dioxide wastage and emissions that we can avoid by changing our use of energy, changing our use of land, and by changing the way in which we consume, because goods and things that we buy and sell also contain carbon in their manufacture and transport. The second thing about the climate change debate, which is really a very powerful thing, is it is extremely unfairly distributed. It's creating damage most to people who are the least causes of the problem. This is particularly the case for small island states like the Maldives, which may disappear completely before the end of this whole century, but have really got nothing to say whatsoever about the addition of carbon from their own economies. This is well known, but it does raise a wider question that inequality and lack of fairness of treatment in the sustainability debate is one of the growing issues that we need to face. That the people with the power and the influence and the wealth who are acquiring this and keeping it forever and ever are the ones who are increasingly causing grief to very many millions and indeed billions who really are not yet in a position to do anything except to take the consequences as we can redesign. So somewhere down the line there's going to have to be some form of debate about taking some of the wealth from the excessively wealthy and placing that into some form of charitable operation that really does get to grips with the sustainability at the local level, the kind we're talking about in Malawi. And I think over the next 10 to 15 years that debate will intensify and will come about. And the climate change aspect of this and the biodiversity aspect of this will certainly give rise to. So that's the second reason why climate change is important. It's not just remorseless, but it's also deeply inequitable. The third thing is it has a huge implication for future generations. And this is a driving line around sustainability, which is to make sure that the generation that's already being born and their offspring, who are the grandchildren of people who are giving birth to children today, that these two generations, which essentially take us to 2150, can actually end up by still living in an habitable world with some degree of fairness and reasonableness of treatment, in a world which has still got hope and viability to it. And I think we really do have a moral obligation as a group of contemporary citizens to provide that opportunity for our offspring and for the offspring of our offspring. In that sense, the sustainability stewardship is a form of tenancy of the planet, maintaining its viability, its fabric of ecosystem survival, so that generations to come can still keep ticking over without either spending huge amounts of money repairing damage or being forced to suffer from all kinds of deprivation as a result of not being able to make a decent living out of the planet we've got left and we bequeath to them. So climate change picks up all of these three areas, so they're more generic to sustainability overall. The second major theme is the loss of food availability in relation to a growing population. This is again a major question, and I really want to give it only a short attention, this speech, because it is already widely discussed. But the driving factor here is that we're changing the availability of land and water for food availability, partly by climate change, partly by the way in which illegal activities on land, particularly relating to water, fishing and to forestry, are causing great loss of habitat, with attendant real damage to soil conditions and to water quality. And if you lose both the availability of water, caused in part by over-abstraction and by climate change and drought, and above all the quality of water caused by pollutants and by just willful damage of the water resource, you then give rise to a very great deal of difficulty in getting an adequate food base for the next 2 billion people who are due to come onto this planet before 2050. For that one issue alone, what is known as the food availability aspect is certainly in points which are affordable, and in the context of a drive also to put food or food crops into renewable resources, into ethanol, into biodiesel, those kinds of things are really becoming problematic and need to be addressed in a systematic way. So that's one part of the food debate, and it's certainly very significant. Second part of the food debate, which is even more powerful, is the growth of a wealthier middle class, particularly in India and in China, but also increasingly throughout the world. And one of the ironies of both the reduction in population growth, which is taking place, and also of a changing nature of society in wealth distribution, is that we're getting a greater number of people with, relatively speaking, more wealth than they had 10 years ago. And such people look to food eating habits that they associate with wealth. So they move toward protein-related foods, particularly fish and meat, and they don't seem to take into account that these things take a huge amount of natural resources, particularly in the area of soils and the area of foodstuffs, soil and lots of fish-related food. These things are absorbing vast quantities of the world's ecosystems and land and marine systems in order just to feed a very high end of the food chain. So another major question facing us is how to change people's diets so that they become more sustainable, and in so doing that we maintain the biodiversity and the fabric of land use management that otherwise could be undermined, just simply by changing dietary patterns, not so much by numbers of population. And the third part of the food debate, which is the overall conundrum, is how we manage to develop a new form of awareness of linking food to a different form of consumption pattern, not just in terms of not overeating or not over having food which is unsuitable in terms of the natural resource take associated with protein and other high-end products, but also that people are looking at food as the basis around which they can maintain health and they can maintain community viability, and above all that they can maintain their food base on a form of enhanced subsistence, not the same old subsistence which has been around since the 19th century or even before, but an enhanced subsistence that is a self-sufficient form of food relationship to communities and development, which I think we will see emerging in this debate in developing world in particular, and also to an extent in the rural areas of the emerging economies in India and China, and that needs a lot more attention than we're giving right now. So that's the second major area that we have to address in terms of the big picture. The third area is the area of the loss of ecosystems, and we've talked a bit about this, but we need to put more attention to it because ecosystem services, everything from providing a buffering against pollution or providing a buffering against sea level rise, because some of the greatest ways in which you can protect a coast are by maintaining mangroves and by retaining salt marshes and other natural ways coasts can aggrade in relation to sea level rise. Losing those because of the need for fishing or for predation in relation to new tourist development is a hugely damaging outcome in terms of bad management of land and water in relation to ecosystem services and to long-term costs and viability. So we need to start redesigning the whole notion of land use and the way we actually care for the processes which nurture us and protect us and buffer us from change, so that these processes are given full tilt. So again, this idea of enhanced self-reliance, which I'm emphasizing for Malawi, may well be putting more emphasis upon maintaining such things as the soil fertility by leaving detritus around so it can allow its nutrients to go back into the soil, or by planting trees so as you retain the soil surface in relation to rainfall, and especially heavy rainfall, or by changing cropping patterns. These things are part of ecosystem services provision, as well as enhancing the quality of food production and guaranteeing a higher quality and overall availability of food which is affordable to local communities. The fourth area, which is not yet given as much attention as should be, is urbanization, because here we have a situation which is very noticeable in that half the world's population has already become urbanized, and by 2050, 3/4 of the world's population will be urbanized. But what's more significant is the rapid growth of urbanization in developing poor economies, because rural areas are rapidly declining and hitting very high levels of poverty, and people being forced to migrate into cities in great numbers. And the real challenge facing us in the next 10 or 15 years is to manage the growth of cities so that they are sustainable, that they are providing working livelihoods for people, and that they are, above all, don't end up by creating even more predation of the planet than is the case right now. Because the danger of living in a city is that people are cut off from nature. Their behaviour and consumption patterns become anaesthetized to the effect of what they're doing on the natural world, particularly for the future generations' well-being. And of course, urban areas give rise to a lot of tumult in terms of cultural clashes and a large degree of social dismay and disruption. So the growth of urbanization is potentially a hotbed of non-sustainability and a great degree of likelihood of social turmoil and quite potentially very significant security hazard. So we need to think very carefully about redesigning the next phase of city growth into much more sustainable village level or small scale level agglomerations within city space, rather than simply having large, amorphous, extremely unmanaged cities. And that's a big challenge that we face in the next 10 years. And then the final one, but they're all connected up, is health. The real impact of all the things we've been discussing. Climate change is affecting health by changing disease patterns and insects availability. Pollution associated with misuse of land and agriculture is causing tremendous ill health problems, particularly pesticides getting into watercourses and into the atmosphere. And of course, the whole issue of food, obesity, and food itself being highly contaminated often, especially if it's not adequately cared for in refrigeration and storage and transport. All of those things are giving rise to major health diseases. But lying in the wings, as you I'm sure all know, are potentially global health hazards around pandemics of one kind or another, where we may end up by having very severe infections which are not easily controlled by the normal patterns of antibiotics. So public health and managing the health of communities in such a way that they are really brought into the day-to-day lives of proactive care at the household level, the community level, throughout all aspects of the globe, may well be part of the new look about what's called enhanced self-reliance and sustainability, which is what I think is the general line we're talking about in this particular context. So that gives you some sense of the big picture. And then to finish off, I thought I might spend a little bit of time on what might be the ways in which we as a society have to address these things and are beginning to address these things, so you get some idea of the hooks around which you can start looking for change. And in a subsequent video, I would like to say a bit more about what all this means for Malawi, but I want to put the two into a complementary package rather than have it all as one. The first thing we're learning is that the conventional economic growth model, the model which is still the dominant model in the United Kingdom, in the United States, in North America generally, and throughout Europe, that model is very much likely to fail when it comes to the issues we've been discussing. It's producing unemployment, particularly amongst young people. It's not producing high-quality jobs. It's not providing enough input into adaptability to the issues associated with global environmental change. And above all, it's a model which doesn't have built into it an understanding what people are really looking for in their lives, which is a sense of well-being, of betterment, of feeling good about themselves, of having confidence and capability, and using all of that to give themselves a leg up, an opportunity to make this enhanced self-reliance function. There's nothing about the contemporary economic development model which is seriously addressing this notion of confidence building, capability building, and of well-being enhancement. And I think that this kind of measure and the way we put resources to helping people at the local level to do these kinds of things will increasingly become part of the next generation sustainability. So various forms of schemes which enhance self-reliance, which enhance enterprise, which enhance the opportunity of people to try to get round the scale of poverty alleviation by making their own sources of income in relation to sustainability and social betterment. That theme will become one part of the new look of sustainability, which I think will be spilling over into Malawi and the work of the Responsible Safari Company. The second major area is around the notion of social investment or social enterprise, making sure that next generation, doesn't matter what age people are, but obviously gearing to younger people, have resource and capacity to offset otherwise great social and environmental hardship that takes place if we don't change direction from all the points I made to you before. So there's a lot of interest in the idea of investing in enterprise for young people so that they care for each other and they care for elderly people and they care for communities, that they reduce people's burden of electricity, of food waste, that they help people to redesign how they use water and how they use food and how they use waste, so that the household and the community can become much more sensitive to this type of management of resources. And above all, that they create the conditions for the next generation to feel good about enhancing overall community well-being. So the notion of what's called the sustainability or resilient village, and village is a term of art for any community of any scale, is becoming quite a popular one. It's a kind of transformative notion. It's allowing society to transform itself by this form of very creative ways of moving into enterprise and well-being, so that they can actually create a new form of economy which is enduring, but based upon all the functions we talked about, both social functions of well-being, ecological functions of well-being, and economic functions of well-being, but in that sequence, because it's a very important sequence to follow. So that's the second area. I'm calling this, for example, for the sake of the argument, transformative enhancement towards self-reliance. And I think we'll find more of that happening as society comes to terms with these things. The third area, and the area I'm going to leave you with at this phase of the discussion, is a new form of science. I call this a science for sustainability. It's also a science to help sustainability citizenship. And science in this context is a science of knowledge generation and of sharing understanding and of being better equipped to cope with the future. The purpose of science, above all, is to provide a knowledge base which is relatively reliably based upon good evidence, but at the same time is a kind of conversation with people, saying to people, look, these are the kinds of implications if we carry on as we're doing now, where the world might be looking like this, might have these implications for security, for migration, for people's well-being, for economies. But if we do this or we do that as a society, or if the global community takes a view on carbon reduction or demand of food in a different way, then these are the kinds of outcomes. So you can look at the scenarios or stories or metaphors of change that allow people at any age to start thinking about what this might mean for me, for my village, for my future, for my children, if we go in this direction or that direction. And that's something that science itself can't do. What science can do is provide some of the background understanding of the conditions that would give rise to what you might call meaningful, sustainable, self-reliant outcomes. But they can't do the full thing. To do the full thing needs a gathering of the communities involved. It involves a new form of learning by young people. And above all, it needs a very strong engagement with business and with government in such a way that everybody is pitching in the same direction. We may well find that this, what I call science for sustainability, becomes the basis around which companies like the Responsible Safari Company can take their ideas and their efforts forward. Because lying behind this is the notion that we should be preparing every child from the age of 5 on, and certainly from 12 on, into a set of what we might call qualifications for sustainability citizenship. These would be around the theme of being able to be adaptable in the way in which you acquire knowledge, interpret knowledge, and manage knowledge. So we're not discipline bound, or not stuck just by numbers, but we can also deal with these rather much more subtle areas like well-being and emotion and intuition. And secondly, we need a form of communication so that people can understand and share how these different choices have to be made. Because if we don't articulate what we know, and what we also articulate what we don't know and what we need to search for, that's not good communication. So having those skills and having them so that they're efficiently generated is a very important part of this whole process. The third area is to try to give people a sense of leadership, a responsibility to take things on their own initiative, to carry the people with them, but do so in such a way that they feel very strongly supported by and supportive of what you're trying to do. So leadership is not just about pushing forward, but having the courage within yourself to know that others can work with you. So you're creating co-leadership and the outcome of leadership rather than just doing it on your own. And finally, part of all of this is about employability, about the capacity to be empathetic, the capacity to be understanding of others' needs, the capacity to understand how a problem can be converted into a solution, looking for imaginative new ways and finding how to get past barriers so that all of these new ways become feasible and possible to achieve. Because the transition to sustainability, by definition, is going to involve innovation and experimentation and schemes of investment and trial that we've really had no likes of before. And again, this Responsible Safari Company is geared very much as a company to promoting that kind of thing. So in many ways, this company, in my view, promotes the very ideals of this form of engaged science. It's got two names, a Science for Sustainability, and you may come across this later on, called Future Earth, which is a science for global sustainability run by the major international scientific unions, but being converted through business, government and civil society into action on the ground. So I'm leaving you with this final set of thoughts, that we are at a very critical age. Anyone watching this particular video will be aware of most of the things I've said, but they'll also be aware that in the next 10 years we can really have to make choices around which we haven't addressed collectively these choices before. And we start with ourselves, having the conviction and the commitment and the understanding and seeking that level of knowledge that we can make the right decisions ourselves. Then we need to reach out to people like the Responsible Safari Company and others who can help us work these things through. That's the co-leadership model I was talking about. And then we need to start trying out schemes which lead to what might call sustainability villages or communities through the idea of collective self-enhanced self-sufficiency. And finally, we need to recognise that this can coalesce into a new form of citizenship, a new form of economics, and a new form of social and ecological resilience and survival. That's the message, that's the model, that's what's on offer. I don't even want to contemplate, if we don't do these things in the next 10 years, what the outcome might be, because you can work out that's the dark side of the moon. I'm interested in the bright side of the moon, which can flourish and recreate, because we can clothe it no longer as a moon, but as a form of existence which becomes the next generation of what we 5 million years ago began as Homo sapiens. Now we have a responsibility to make sure that for the next 5 million years there are at least some hope that Homo sapiens can continue, but in such a way that they are caring for this planet, caring for each other, and being happy and joyful in the process. There's no reason why that can't be done. And many parts of this great nation that I'm in, Malawi, already show that people have a great capacity to survive under the most amazingly difficult circumstances because they are happy and very content in the way in which they relate to each other. What they need is the kind of support to build on that fundamental so they can really generate a well-being for themselves and for their children that really can't be done unless we all work together. So good luck to you all, and let's hope all of this works through the great offices of this own company, but also through all of you who are doing your own thing in your own way over the next decade, because that's the decade that counts. Beyond that, we've either got somewhere and are making progress, or in the dark ages. Let's hope it's not the latter. Good luck to you all. Bye-bye.